Hello, my name is Shreyans and this is a series on developing your equity research process. In this video, we are going to talk about another category of ratios that are liquidity ratios, right? So when we talked about solvency ratios, we were concerned about the long-term financial health and sustainability of the company, but not just long-term is all important, but short-term is also important because you have to have the short-term liquidity to meet the regular requirements or the day-to-day requirements of the business, right? So with liquidity ratios, we're trying to assess exactly that and also the ability of the company to pay any short-term liabilities that it might have. So let's get started. Right. So now there are quite a few ratios with respect to liquidity, and we'd look at these one by one, right? So the first couple of ratios are current ratio and quick ratio. And current ratio, as you would know, is current assets upon current liabilities. And when we calculate the quick ratio, we remove inventories and any prepaid expenses from the current assets, right? And what these basically tell us is, right, how well can our assets cover any current liabilities or any short-term liabilities that we might have, right? The next one is working capital. So it's not exactly a ratio, but it's an amount that we calculate. And working capital is the difference between current assets and current liabilities. So you subtract current liabilities from current assets, and that gives you the working capital. So this basically tells you that how much are you invested, how much capital have you invested into the day-to-day functioning, into the short-term working of the company per se, right? And now we're going to calculate a few ratios that are related to the efficiency of the short-term operations. So remember that while we calculated efficiency ratios, we calculated receivable turnover, payable turnover, inventory turnover, and that is exactly what we have. The other version of it, which is receivable days, inventory days, and payable days, right? So for example, the receivable turnover ratio is 6 times, right? Which means that you're completing 6 cycles. That means the length of one cycle is approximately 60 to 61 days, right? So that ratio was in terms of number of times. This ratio is in terms of number of days. So basically, what you would want is the receivable and payable days to be as low as possible and payable days to be as high as possible, of course, within the limits or the time limits that you have set in order to make your payments, right? So when your receivable days are shorter, what it means is you are collecting payments very quickly from the credit sales that you've done, from the customers that you have, right? Smaller inventory days basically means that you're able to convert raw material to a finished product in lesser number of days, which means your production is very efficient and you can produce multiple products using the same resources, right? That is there. Then we have payable days, which is basically the time you take between purchasing and paying your suppliers, right? So you'd want to take benefit of uh, taking whatever time is available there, right? Obviously, there are discounts as well that suppliers might give you. So that is another thing that a company evaluates, whether it wants to take avail of the full credit period or if it wants to settle early and take discounts. And the net of these three is the operating cycle, the length of the operating cycle, or sometimes it is called as the cash cycle as well. So receivable days plus inventory days and less payable days, right? Because inventory days is the time it takes you to convert from raw material to product. Receivable days is the time it takes you from converting the sale of the product to getting cash for the product. So from raw material to production, from production then you've sold that product, and from sales to cash, right? And then you're also getting some sort of credit on the purchases that you've made earlier, so that reduces the length of the operating cycle. Again, you would want this operating cycle to be as short as possible, because that means you can complete multiple operating cycles within 1 year. The more number of cycles that you can complete, the more revenues you can generate, and hopefully add good profitability as well. Now, there's one more very important one, and it's actually very interesting as well. This is called the defensive interval ratio. This is also calculated in days. And what it basically tells us about is how much cash does the company have to meet its daily expenses, right? So we take the total expenses that have been incurred, the total operating expenses that have been incurred in the year, and we divide it by 365, so which gives us the daily expenses. and then we basically compare the daily expenses with our total cash reserve. So we can take cash, cash equivalents, and we can also take receivables. So that basically tells us that this is the liquidity, this is the money that we have, and these are our daily expenses. And you can basically calculate that how much money do you have to cover X days worth of expenses, right? And if you think about it, if your defensive interval ratio or the defensive interval days are less than the operating cycle, which means your operating cycle is already extending beyond the funds that you have to operate for a specific period, right? So what you want is your operating cycle to be shorter, so you can replenish your cash and then you can spend whatever you have to, right? Because if your operating cycle is very long, it means that the time from getting raw materials to making sales and getting money for that is very long, and in the meantime you're going to exhaust your cash resources to meet the expenses, and that might be a very big problem for the company. Because what defensive interval basically tells you that this is the amount of money we have to meet these days worth of expenses. For anything beyond that, we would have to liquidate our non-current assets, which would be a plant or machinery or any long-term investments that the company might have, and that is not something that a company would want to do, because the long-term assets or the non-current assets are actually used in the production or providing of services, right? So that is not something a company wants. The company wants to generate cash from its operations and service all the expenses from that. So what you'd want is an operating cycle that is shorter than the defensive interval cycle, so that you can continuously generate cash and meet the day-to-day requirements, expense requirements of your business, basically. All right, so that was pretty much it about liquidity ratios, right? A lot of times we pay a lot of attention to solvency, but liquidity is also important, because if you cannot survive in the short term, then surviving in the long term is obviously, there is no scope of long term if you cannot survive in the short term, right? So these ratios are more or less very straightforward to calculate. And as you could see, then a lot of the ratios or a lot of the measures can be seen in tandem with each other, and also a lot of the days, like the receivable days and the payable days, they could be seen in tandem with the efficiency related ratios to have a good idea about the operations of the company. So that was it with regards to the liquidity ratios. I hope you can calculate them very easily and also understand that what's really happening with respect to these ratios. In the next video, we are going to discuss the final category of ratios, which are return ratios, and also do a DuPont breakdown, which is very interesting and very important. So stay tuned for that.